Do not mistake my silence for consent. How many doors must we knock before the seat we were promised is no longer treated like charity? The rules are the rules. Step aside and let the process work.
The chandeliers hummed above them as the room tightened, winter on one side of the velvet robe and warm approval on the other. Monica didn't move, and in that stillness, the script people relied on began to stutter. Eyes shifted, a bow hesitated, and a dozen phones rose like small verdicts. Tonight would answer a simple question. Do rules protect fairness, or only those who wrote them? If this moment speaks to you, leave one word, justice, in the comment, and follow to hear what happens when silence finally answers back. The chandeliers hummed above them as the room tightened, winter on one side of the velvet robe and warm approval on the other. Monica didn't move, and in that stillness, the script people relied on began to stutter. Eyes shifted, a bow hesitated, and a dozen phones rose like small verdicts. Tonight would answer a simple question. Do rules protect fairness, or only those who wrote them? If this moment speaks to you, leave one word, justice, in the comments, and follow to hear what happens when silence finally answers back. The chandeliers hummed above them as the room tightened, winter on one side of the velvet robe and warm approval on the other. Monica didn't move, and in that stillness, the script people relied on began to stutter. Eyes shifted, a bow hesitated, and a dozen phones rose like small verdicts. Tonight would answer a simple question. Do rules protect fairness, or only those who wrote them? If this moment speaks to you, leave one word, justice, in the comments, and follow to hear what happens when silence finally answers back. Snow whispered across Fifth Avenue as Monica Carter stepped from the Blacktown car and into the draft that funneled toward the grand steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Astorwell Gala had been splashed across the papers for weeks, but almost no one suspected that this particular night would become the turning point that undid a dynasty. She drew her coat closer, thanked the valet with a small nod born of long habit, and crossed the salted stone where boots had carved 1,000 damp crescents into the slush. Inside the glass, warm light pooled like honey. Outside, the air tasted of tin and winter. Her goal was simple, and she kept it framed in her thoughts. Move through the entrance with quiet dignity. Observe the room, shake a few hands, and let the evening proceed as planned. The museum's facade glowed behind her, its columns caught in a soft halo, the kind of light that makes a city feel ceremonial. December in New York has a way of lending ceremony even to ordinary hours. On a gala night, it multiplies the effect. Porters in dark coats hurried to tug open the heavy doors for familiar faces. Laughter floated out, warm as steam. At the podium, a velvet rope cleaved the cold from the warm. A security guard named Brian managed the list with the briskness of a man who judged himself by the smoothness of a line. He was tall, square-shouldered, his tie knotted too tight. He had a polite smile he used like a lid. Monica waited, then offered her embossed invitation and a greeting as even as her breath. He glanced at the paper, flicked his eyes to her face, then down again, as if the name might rearrange itself if he stared long enough. He asked for identification, his tone neutral in the way that tells you it is anything but. Monica's wallet had a simple order. Driver's license in the first sleeve, a few cards behind it, nothing extra. She placed the license on the podium, the surface slightly damp from snow shaking off coats. "Thank you," she said. She did not explain who she was. That was not her way. He lifted the card to the light and tipped it back and forth as if the texture could confess a lie. "One moment," he said, though the moment stretched like taffy. Behind her, tires crackled over salt as another car rolled up, pulled away, rolled up, pulled away. Guests came in little eddies. Couples in winter silk and cashmere. A man who laughed too loudly into the wind. Women in bright shows that peeped from beneath their coats for the few seconds between car door and threshold. Brian waved them forward after the briefest glance at their invitations. A white-haired gentleman in a scarf patterned like a chessboard joked with him about the cold. They exchanged the easy nods of men who expected to be recognized. Monica stood with her gloved hands resting lightly on the podium's edge and watched. "Please," Brian said to a thin woman in a sable wrap, "go right ahead," and lifted the rope. He turned back to Monica. "I will need to verify this," he said, meaning the invitation. He kept her driver's license too, pinched in his fingers like a delicate thing. He consulted the list again, tracing with one blunt finger as if searching for a misfiled letter. "I do not see a Carter," he said. He pronounced it like a line he had rehearsed. "If you will step aside for a moment." He gestured toward a little rectangle floor that might as well have been a chalk square. She stepped where he pointed. The thought of her go enter without fuss, maintain composure, read the room remained. The museum's doors sighed open and shut. Warmth spilled. Inside, a string quartet tuned in the west gallery. The sound ballooned, then went thin. A porter moved carts of glassware that chimed like little bells. Outside, the cold crept up Monica's sleeves with the patience of a careful thief. Moments became minutes, and minutes began to behave like hours. A couple from the Upper East Side breezed in, their invitation barely out of its envelope. A hedge fund partner whose name regularly wrote the business section stepped past with a swift, impersonal smile. A familiar editor from a national magazine nodded to the guard, who nodded back, and Monica noted the easy recognition that functioned like a key. She felt the small pull to explain herself and let it pass. The world is not moved by explanations offered at the door. Twice she asked, in the voice that would not crack the air, whether the verification was complete. Twice Brian said he was still checking. He did not pick up a phone, he did not speak into a radio, he did not consult a supervisor. He made a show of scanning names, as if the paper might, with enough time, confess an error favorable to him. The snow began to stick to the shoulders of her coat, a polite dusting at first, then a stipple that dampened the wool. A young couple in their first tuxedo and first gown hovered near, glanced at her, then looked away with the flutter of people who want to belong and fear, learning that belonging has conditions. Inside, servers circled with trays of canapes, warm goggeries threaded with steam, little coins of beet on dollops of chervray, miniature crab cakes that smelled faintly of lemon. The bartender flicked a towel over his shoulder, lined crystal coops like notes on a staff, and accepted folded bills slipped into a glass as the evening began to take on its soundtrack. Monica had been taught as a child to leave a generous tip when the service was right and not to use a tip like a leash. The habit stuck. She wondered whether the bartender could see her through the glass. A cluster of guests cut its own path toward the entrance. The rope lifted for them before they reached it. Someone joked about the way December turns the steps into theater. Brian laughed the laugh of a man eager to show he knew the reference. He handed a woman back an invitation with a flourish. He kept Monica's license where it was, returned to the list, tapped a line that had no Carter on it, and shook his head with sorrow that did not belong to him. "Almost finished," he said. The words were alit again. Nearly 2 hours slid by in this fashion. The code sinking from coat to dress, from dress to skin, from skin to bone. Monica sank her breath into her chest and steadied it, as she had on nights when meetings stretched long and a single sentence could throw a wrench into a year of work. What she wanted in this moment was simple. A seat near a heat vent, a glass of water, a few quiet minutes to gather herself before the speeches. She remained still. She did not perform the act of patience. She practiced it. A woman in a velvet headband paused on her way in, offered Monica the barest sympathetic smile, then decided not to complicate her night. A man in a snow-dusted peacoat, younger, considered offering help and chose not to. People are forever choosing not to. Inside, a photographer called for a group to shift left. Someone laughed from the back of the frame, flash popped. The moment was preserved as if it were whole. On the museum steps, tires hissed, then fell silent. The city kept doing what it does, moving, shining, looking. Brian eventually reappeared with the invitation and the license, as if he had descended into a labyrinth to retrieve them. His eyebrows sketched apology, though his mouth did not. "You may proceed," he said, and adjusted the robe with a flourish that implied he had made a discretionary call. He did not meet her eyes when he returned the cards. A thin track of moisture had appeared at the corner of her license where the lamination had lifted. He smoothed it with his thumb and placed it back in her wallet. She thanked him. She thanked him because a refusal to thank would be a victory no one could see, but everyone would understand. The doors exhaled warm air. The music inside had settled into something elegant and uninsistent. the scent of beeswax and evergreen rose from garlands that had been wired to the banister. The docent offered a folded program with a map of the evening and a list of sponsors. Monica stepped through her boots, finding the runner late for guests. The coat check gleamed with brass numbers. The attendants, quick and deft, lifted coats like tailors, smoothed wool as if it were silk. She handed over her coat, accepted the ticket, slid it into the pocket of her clutch. Her shoulders felt suddenly light and suddenly cold all at once. She took in the West Gallery with a long, level glance, measuring light and distance the way other people measure the cut of a dress. A server passed with a tray. Monica asked for water, and the woman smiled, the kind of smile that says, yes is the default, and brought a glass without drama. Monica set it on a high table and let her hands rest around the bowl, taking the warmth the glass had stolen from the room. On the nearby wall, a Renaissance portrait sat in its gilded cage. The subject, forever 19, forever staring into a room that would outlive his painter. The evening's master of ceremonies tested his microphone at a whisper that bled into the music. A pair of trustees walked by within a short gate and the smell of expensive winter aftershave. Names rose and fell. The Astorwell crest gleamed near the stage beneath a spray of flowers that had come from a florist famous for making large money look like restraint. Monica stood still long enough to hear the rhythm of the room and then turn it into information. Who spoke to whom, who looked over a shoulder, who kept their glass full. The habit also stuck. Her purpose remained. She would not let the cold or the delay or the little humiliations that nest themselves in delays alter the shape of it. She would listen, speak when the word could turn a hinge, and leave when the hour told her she had taken from the night what was needed. At the edge of her mind, a sentence clicked into place. Dignity is not armor. It is a bearing. She smoothed the skirt of her dress, where the snow had left small, damp constellations that now melted into nothing. Far across the gallery, a junior staffer from the family foundation lifted the phone to film the first sweep of the room for a social post. The lens caught chandeliers, canvas, dresses, faces, music, light. It did not catch the hours at the rope. It did not catch the quiet arithmetic of what is given and what is withheld. It is never the camera's job to catch those things. It is a person's job. Monica picked up her glass, lifted it to her lips, and let the water wash away the metallic edge the cold had left in her mouth. A maitre in a black suit appeared at her elbow with the politeness of a well-run house. "Welcome," he said. "If you need anything this evening, please ask me." He meant it, Monica could tell. "Thank you," she answered, and the words sat between them like a small square of cloth laid on a table. She watched him leave and feel the question about seating with the grace of a man who kept 100 maps in his head. It was then that the orchestra's melody changed, swelling with the cue that the formal program would begin. The hum of conversation rose and fell as guests found their places. She surveyed the entrance one more time, not out of habit, but because habit can be a kind of foresight. A gust of cold slid in through the doors as the last cluster of arrivals crossed the threshold, laughing at nothing particular. Monica's breath steadied, then deepened. The room waited in the way rooms do when nothing has happened yet and everything has already begun. Monica drew a long breath and stepped into the splendid ballroom, not yet knowing that beyond its crystal lights awaited not only chandeliers, but a public humiliation. Music and laughter unfurled from the galleries like warm ribbons, masking the thin edges that cut when people decide who belongs. Monica stepped from the entrance corridor into the grand hall where the ceiling floated high and pale, and the chandeliers scattered small constellations across polished stone. What had begun outside a quiet sorting at the velvet rope continued here with silkier gloves. She felt it before she heard it. The shift of a group's attention when a person walks in whom the room did not expect to see. She had told herself to move with purpose and economy, to keep the evening's aim simple. Read the room, take the measure of the hosts, conserve warmth and dignity. A server in a crisp jacket passed with flutes of sparkling wine and little tartlets crowned with jeweled fruit. Monica thanked her and asked for water. The server smiled, promised to return, and slipped away through the traffic of sequins and tuxedo lapels. From the raised platform at the far end, a quartet eased into a standard everyone knew by heart, a melody that whispers of old New York winters. The sound buoyed conversations to the comfortable level, where it is easy to glide through without bumping into a feeling. Near the center of the hall stood Margaret Astorwell, in a dress the exact color of chilled champagne, pearls arranged at her throat, in a pattern that spoke of catalog pages and old money rules. She leaned toward a friend and spoke in a tone that was meant to travel. "The staff must be coming through the main hall tonight," she said, eyes grazing Monica as if brushing lint. The friend's laugh was too quick, the laugh of a person eager to be caught in the current of someone else's authority. Margaret did not look at Monica again. She looked at the circle that watched her look away. On the low dais to the right, Ethan Astorwell lifted a coupe with the careless grace of a man who had practiced his posture more than his craft. He stood inside a halo of friends, cheeks bright, the surface of his drink barely disturbed. "Did someone order extra hands for the floor?" he said, making a little show of scanning the room. His audience rewarded him with laughter. One man clapped him lightly on the shoulder, another raised his glass to endorse the joke as if it were a toast to order and tidiness. Monica passed on, neither slowing nor quickening her pace. She had learned long ago the cost of letting some small performance take over her itinerary. Charlotte Astorwell had stationed herself where the light was kind and the background art would flatter a photograph. She held her phone at the angle that thins the jaw and lifts the eyes. "Turn a little," she told a friend, then directed the lens past a friend's shoulder toward Monica with a smile that did not reach her pupils. "Caught a moment," she murmured, and the friend laughed, primed to enjoy whatever would be posted. Charlotte's thumb danced, an app bloomed, a video stitched itself together from a few seconds of movement and a caption that made the point sharper than the image. The title she chose was Arch and Weightless, a throwaway she could later call a joke if she needed to. At the bar, a bartender arranged bottles as if they were chess pieces, the amber and garnet liquids catching the chandelier light. A trustee placed a photo bill in the tip jar with an easy flick of the wrist. The bartender's eyes warmed, his thank you genuine. Monica reached the edge of the bar and asked again, gently, for water. The bartender's eyes slid past her to where Margaret watched. Margaret answered with a small tilt of her head, equal parts refusal and dismissal. The bartender's face changed by a hair's breadth, the little tightening that belongs to a person who knows he is being watched by the person who pays him. "I am sorry, ma'am," he said quietly. "I have to finish a set of orders." He began polishing a glass that did not need polishing. "This is a private gala," someone near the floral arch said, and the sentence puffed into the air like breath in winter. A conversation near the donor wall broke and reformed around it. The donors, names etched in a column of bronze, looked down with the long patience of metal. Monica stood where the sidewalk of people met the crossroads of servers and watched the flow. She marked who glanced at her and then at someone who could deliver a social verdict. She marked who simply looked and then returned to their talk. The habit of reading patterns, honed over many long years, put a kind of order under the noise. The quartet slid into a quieter piece. Monica found a place near a marble pillar and let her breathing sink to the slow arc of the melody. A woman in a winter white jacket passed and, for a fraction of a second, offered a sympathetic look. Then the woman's gaze hitchhiked back to Charlotte's phone as a notification chimed. A dozen little hearts, then 2 dozen, then a cluster of comments that asked in a knowing tone what was happening at the Met tonight. Monica had no interest in the phone's message. She had interest in the way the room took its cue from a caption written to sound harmless. Margaret's voice rose again. "Just enough. It is always awkward when people wander in through the wrong entrance," she told her circle. "Security must be new." A man nodded solemnly as if she had observed a law of physics. Ethan wandered closer to the bar, traded a private joke with the bartender, then set his empty glass down and tapped the bass with one finger, a little drum roll that meant refill. The bartender refilled it, and Ethan slid a folded bill toward the tip jar with the relaxed benevolence of a prince bestowing coin. He pivoted on a heel, took in the room with a pleased look, and let his gaze fall on Monica. The smile that followed was impersonal and sharp. "Find the service team," he said, to no one in particular, loud enough. "We need hands near the south door." One of Charlotte's friends aimed her phone back the other way. "Turn a bit, Char. The light on the painting is perfect." Charlotte obliged, then pretended to catch Monica in the corner of the frame, as if the lens had happened upon something it could not help but see. The video would show a woman in a simple dress near the pillar, hands folded, posture composed. It would not show the hours she had spent on the steps, or the names she had watched being waved in, while her name was parsed like a puzzle. The server who had promised water returned with a glass on a small tray. She set it on a cocktail table within reach. Margaret's voice again brushed the air. "No drinks for non-guests," she said. Not quite to the server, not quite not to her. The server hesitated, looked at the bar, then at Monica with an apology she could not safely deliver aloud, and lifted the glass again. "Of course," she whispered, and moved away. The scene was small, but the room absorbed it and made it instructional. A few people smiled the brittle smiles of those who enjoy watching rules enforced, when the rule is merely a person's preference dressed up as a policy. Monica reminded herself of the evening's aim: observe, conserve, do not dissipate on other people's theater. She watched a pair of city council aides work the room with the restless energy of climbers who understand that smiles are a kind of currency. She watched a retired conductor explain to a cluster of 20-somethings why an old melody still drew tears. She watched an older couple, coats already checked, murmur over the seating chart with the focused hope of people who fear being placed near a bore. The city's life was here, in expensive clothes and carefully curated ease, and carried on even as it made a show of deciding who carried on with it. Richard Astorwell made his entrance at last, his hair pruned to the line favored by men who believe their barber remembers their grandfather. He shook hands with an art dealer, took the thanks of a museum board member with the absorption of a man who has learned to count gratitude, then smiled at his wife in a way that said the night was going to plan. When his eyes slid across the room and landed on Monica, something like puzzlement passed, then something like indifference took its place. He turned back to a man whose name controlled a building downtown. "Is that the new event coordinator?" A woman asked Margaret, not lowering her voice as much as she thought she did. "No," Margaret said, "just a misunderstanding at the door." She said it kindly, the way a hostess corrects the placement of a fork. The quartet rested between pieces, and the lull made room for small performances. Ethan's friends coaxed him into a brief turn, a little pantomime of a maitre fielding a complaint. He did it well enough to win fresh laughter. Charlotte stepped down from her dais and drifted toward Monica with a smile that bore all its teeth. "Are you enjoying the view?" she asked in a tone that folded insult into pleasantry. "The galleries are lovely when they're quiet." Monica met her eyes. "They are," she said, her voice even, "when people make them so." Charlotte's smile sharpened. "Let me recommend the South Gallery," she said. "It is less crowded." The suggestion produced a ripple in those who overheard. It sounded like helpfulness if you wanted to believe it, and like relocation if you did not. Monica did not relocate. The server passed with her tray again, and this time Monica asked for a slice of lemon with the water. The server nodded, then corrected herself in mid-nod and said she would check. The bartender poured a round of Manhattan cocktails for a trustee group, accepted a tip that would pay for a week of subway rides, and never lifted his eyes toward the lemon bowl. The music resumed. On the far wall, a projection of winter scenes flickered. Old photographs of New York streets dusted with snow, skaters on the pond, strings of lights over an avenue the color of pewter. It looked like a city that would never do a petty thing. All around, the room practiced its craft. A joke here, a promise there, an offer of a museum tour for a grandchild, a story told to rescue a lull. People asked what school, what firm, what winter plans. They asked about the tree at Rockefeller Center and the displays on Fifth Avenue. They did not ask who Monica was. It was not a curiosity they wished to indulge. That kind of question rearranges the furniture. It might interrupt the night's script. A photographer hoisted a camera. "Closer, please," he called to a group near the floral arch. Charlotte tilted her chin. Margaret centered herself without moving her feet. Richard slid in at the last moment, his cuff catching the light perfectly. The photographer took 2 frames, then a third for insurance, and murmured the thanks of a man who has learned to keep people's vanity in tempo with his shutter. The group dispersed with the satisfaction of a job done and an image secured. 2 young donors checked their phones, showed one another a post, and looked up in surprise that a small clip had already found an audience beyond the room that had laughed. Monica's patience held, not the brittle patience that fractures at the first step, but the kind forged by long practice. She had been a girl at church suppers where the line for pie did not always treat everyone with the same courtesy. She had been a young analyst at a firm where the senior partner pronounced her name wrong for months. She had been a guest at tables where the blessing forgot to bless the hands that cooked. She knew the feel of a room when people make a sport of reminding someone of the rules. She knew how to let the sport use up its oxygen. A staffer from the museum approached with a polite smile and a clipboard. "May I help you find your table?" she asked. Monica thanked her and gave the table number printed on the invitation. The staffer's eyes flicked to the card and back. She clicked her pen against the paper on the board, then gestured toward a cluster of tables near the back, where the view of the stage was partially interrupted by a column. It was not an insult big enough to call by name. It was a nudge that thought it could pass for logistics. "If you prefer a better line of sight, I can check with the host," the staffer offered, the courage in her voice small but present. "Thank you," Monica said. "This will do." The staffer, relieved and grateful for the grace, promised to send water with lemon straight away. It almost arrived. The glass materialized on a tray near her table, then vanished again under an instruction Monica did not need to hear. The room read the moment and stored it as precedent. A woman at a neighboring table, gray hair perfectly swept, cleared her throat in an old-world way and said to her husband, "Do you want still or sparkling?" The husband said, "Either is fine," and they smiled at each other with long marriage softness. Monica let the small sweetness settle the air around her like a warmer shawl. What mattered was the rhythm of escalation, the way slight after slight seeks an audience and finds one. The room had begun to purr with that energy. From the stage, a stage manager waved a discreet cue. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone. A hush telescoped across the space as if someone had dimmed the lights by a breath. Charlotte tucked her phone into a small purse. Ethan squared his shoulders. Margaret tested her smile in the reflective glass of a display case. Richard folded his notes with the satisfaction of a man who prefers his own openings to other people's. Monica remained exactly where she needed to be. In the room, in the light, in the sightlines of those who would later claim not to have seen. The hush widened to include the little sound's eyes against crystal, a chair leg easing, the whisper of a silk skirt. She felt in her chest the first tremor of weather changing. Not outside on Fifth Avenue where the snow traced careful lines on the museum steps, but inside the great hall where a different kind of front was gathering. Monica remained calm in a quiet corner, her eyes observing, but inside the weather gathered into a storm. The orchestra softened to a murmur that let every small sound bloom the brush of silk against the chair back, the faint clink of glass on tray, the hush that settles when the room gathers around its own reflection. In that lull, the evening made space for little performances to claim attention, and Charlotte Astorwell stepped into the center of that space with the timing of someone who has practiced timing more than kindness. She crossed the marble with an easy glide, a stemmed glass in her hand, holding a dark garnet red that looked almost black under the chandeliers. The earlier current still moved under the surface. The quick aside near the floral arch had landed where it was meant to land. The joke about extra hands had found its echo. The refusal at the bar had taught the room how to behave without anyone naming the lesson. Monica stood near a high table that reflected the chandelier light like a shallow pool. She had adjusted her posture by a degree, nothing more. That small change said she had counted the exits, measured the distance to the stage, and chosen stillness as a kind of ground. Charlotte arrived with a smile polished to a soft sheen. "You must be chilled," she said, the tone gentle enough to pass inspection from across the hall. "Please, have this." She lifted the glass a fraction, the gesture intimate and public at once. Conversation nearby thinned the way conversations thin when a good seat in a theater suddenly looks better than a mediocre one. Monica met her eyes. "Water will do," she said, neither refusing nor accepting the premise of the scene. "Just for a moment," Charlotte replied, and a laugh fluttered at the edge of her words, like a friend waiting to be invited in. Around them, the donors' names on the bronze wall seemed to glow the way bronze does when the air warms and people gather under light. A trustee's wife tugged her wrap closer, then let it fall. A compromise women make in winter when fashion wrestles with sense. A server paused a beat too long, as if listening for a cue. A young couple who had been practicing their best gala smiles held them a heartbeat longer than necessary, uncertain whether to keep them or set them down. Charlotte tipped the glass toward Monica. "Please," she said, and this time the word carried the faint pressure of a hostess who means never to be refused. Monica extended her hand with the care of a person who prefers peace to theater but refuses to be pushed out of a doorway. Her fingers reached the stem. The glass was cool. The wine trembled. Charlotte moved her foot the smallest distance, the sort of shift a dancer makes to find balance, except this was a search for something else. The toe of her heel touched the edge of Monica's shoe, a nudge as slight as a whisper. Monica's weight shifted the breadth of a breath. The glass tipped. The red arced, a dark ribbon through the bright air, and found the white of Monica's dress with the precision of a mark hit on purpose. It splashed high, then fell in heavy drops that bloomed like peonies opened by a storm. The room's intake of air was almost a cheer. The glass itself struck the marble and broke into a scatter of glittering pieces that would look pretty in a photograph and treacherous to the soles of shoes. A startled sound rose from the nearest cluster, the kind that lets a person pretend surprise while enjoying the inevitability of what surprise has delivered. Charlotte's hand went to her mouth. "Oh my goodness," she said, the words shaped to carry. "I am so sorry." The apology wore quotation marks, an ear could hear. Margaret's voice traveled cleanly from her circle without straining. "This is precisely what I meant." She told no one and everyone. It becomes awkward when people do not know where they belong. Her circle rewarded the clear signal with little nods and small, practiced murmurs. A man near the donor wall said something about housekeeping that was meant to be a joke and succeeded only in proving the shape of his imagination. Monica stumbled half a step and regained her balance as the wine finished its work. The stain spread with a patience that felt cruel, climbing and deepening, as if the fabric were a map and someone had painted a river where no river ran. A ring of phones lifted, some shyly, some like flags. A caption flowered on one screen, a quip in a light font, the kind a person can defend later as harmless. Laughter gathered in pockets, met other pockets, and knit into a sheet that covered the room in sound. A woman at a nearby table shook her head with the clipped disapproval of a person who likes order more than mercy. Ethan drifted closer, riding the laughter as if it were a moving walkway. He angled his phone for a better shot. "Got it," he said to himself, and the two words landed like coins into a jar. The bartender's eyes flashed toward the scene and away again, trained by long practice to note and survive. A server knelt in a small miracle of grace and began to gather the glass, fingers fast and sure, body arranged to hide the worst of it from the view of the nearest cameras. "Careful," she murmured to Monica, and the kindness in her voice, though quiet, made a clean seam in the moment, a seam the rest of the room pretended not to see. Monica's breath steadied. Her hand went, by instinct, to the place where the stain began, then stopped. She let the fabric fall and kept her hands at her sides. She had learned, years ago, that certain gestures feed a scene. She would not feed this one. A small tremor of silence found the immediate air around her, an island the size of a wingspan. The rest of the hall rolled on, buoyed by laughter that reached a volume at which it can be mistaken for music. Charlotte regained her composure with the efficiency of a person who has done this before. "Let me help," she said, already turning to summon a staff member with a small flick of her wrist. The flick said that help would be of the sort that removes, not restores. Margaret looked past Monica to a group just arriving and smiled at them as if nothing unpleasant had happened at all. Reacher, calculating from the perimeter, took stock the way a man takes stock of a draft in a room he had thought he had closed, not realizing yet that the cold was entering from somewhere else entirely. The master of ceremonies stood frozen for a beat on the stage, choosing whether to proceed as if nothing had happened or to become the kind of host who names an elephant in the room. He chose the former and lifted a hand, a signal to the quartet to resume. They complied, but the music came out like a memory spoken through clenched teeth. The audience attention split, half to the stage and half to the stain, and what should have been a graceful transition felt like a sweater caught on a nail. A donor at a nearby table offered the clean square of a folded linen napkin. Her husband touched her wrist. "Leave it," he whispered, not unkindly, and she obeyed, though the obedience cost her something she would keep with her on the ride home. The museum staffer with the clipboard looked at Monica, then at Margaret, then at the stage. She moved toward Margaret and then stopped, reconsidered, and moved toward Monica with slow steps. The clipboard hit the tremor in her hands. "Is there anything you need?" she asked, quietly enough that only 2 people heard her. "A chair," Monica said, the word factual. The staffer nodded and went to find one. Before she could return, Margaret glided into the staffer's path and said something that turned the chair into a fire hazard, and the moment into a test, the staffer knew she could not win. The humor at the edges of the room found new subjects. Someone imitated the gasp Charlotte had given, pitching it higher, milking it for laughs. Someone else made a show of taking a long route around the spill, as if it were a lake no one had seen marked on the map. The pitying glances, so useful to the people who cast them, appeared on cue. They had the tidy feel of signatures placed on a petition after the outcome has already been decided. Monica's focus tightened, not into anger, but into clarity. She saw each face near her with the luminous precision people sometimes report after shock Margaret's mouth, small with satisfaction. Charlotte's eyes, already scanning for a new angle that would flatter her role in the scene. Ethan's grin growing brighter under the attention of friends who measured worth by proximity to noise. She saw, too, the staffer with the clipboard hovering at the perimeter wanting to do right, trained to keep her job, feeling the pull of both. She saw a young server's hands shake for half a breath and then grow steady again as she slid the last shard of glass into her towel. The room's laughter crested. Margaret let it run and then, with timing she must have learned at 100 dinners, she wrote the crest and planted a flag. "This is why certain standards matter," she said. And the words, though couched in the cool clarity of a hostess managing a mishap, carried the iron filings of an older sentence that did not speak its name. The circle nearest her rewarded the line with soft agreement. Richard, hearing the tone if not the content, nodded to no one in particular, a reflex of agreement that comes from a lifetime of not needing to listen closely. The orchestra found the end of the piece and laid the last chord down like a napkin. The applause that followed served as a screen behind which the little captions flew out from phones and into the ether. A phrase repeated itself across several counts, variations on a theme that let everyone pretend they were commenting on nothing more than the quality of the wine and the slipperiness of marble. The room blinked in the light of its own righteousness and found itself pleased. In that light, the stain looked almost like a pattern. It crept, found seams, followed them. It gave the fabric a geography that had not been there, a red country on a white continent. Monica watched it do its work with the unblinking attention of a person who knows when a thing must be seen to the end before another thing can begin. The server who had first knelt passed again with her tray. She slowed, almost stopped, then chose, with a courage that felt larger than her apron, to keep moving. The choice was not nothing. It was an act of survival and an act of witness at once. A small group near the entrance laughed too loudly. The sound, brittle now, made a few heads turn. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat and began his remarks with a joke that had worked every year for the past 5. Tonight, it floated for a second and then sank. Attention slipped back, drawn by gravity to the red on the white and the woman who wore it without flinching. The moment stretched past what a room like this usually endures, turned the laughter into a mirror for the people making it. When the last of the glass was gone, Charlotte took a step forward, as if to offer the napkin belatedly. She reconsidered and turned that step into a pivot toward a friend instead. "That was unfortunate," she said, pitching the word to cover 5 meanings. The friend nodded, as if closeness to the stage plot could be mistaken for significance. Margaret laid a hand on the back of a chair and pressed her palm there, leaving no mark anyone could see, and every mark that mattered. Ethan checked his phone. Hearts and comments bloomed in the parade of approval that would age badly by morning. The hush that followed turned dense. The air felt like the inside of a seashell pressed to an ear. In that hush, Monica steadied her breath until it stretched smooth and long. She did not tidy the stain or ask for help she would not be given. Her stillness asked a question that no one in the room was ready to answer. And then, Into that stillness, the sound returned the music, the clapping, the chatter, all louder now for having been paused. Monica lifted her chin, the movement calm and exact. Her eyes found Charlotte, then Margaret, then the thin slice of ceiling above them where the chandeliers threw their bright nets. She had been patient with the small humiliations that signal membership withheld. She understood there comes a minute when patience is not a virtue but a loophole other people use. She did not rush. She did not speak. She let the moment do one more thing it wished to do, announce itself to every corner, and then she let it pass through her like weather. Monica raised her face slowly. Her white dress dyed red, and her eyes shifted from endurance to something quiet and dangerous. The laughter thinned to a sheen across the hall, and the stillness around Monica held the shape of a question that no one dared answer. From the quiet, a clean tone rose. Her phone chimed with a clarity that cut through silk and glass, the kind of sound that arrives when a room believes it has said the last word. She lifted the device without hurry. From the stage, the master of ceremonies offered a practiced smile. Near the bronze donor wall, Margaret's circle arranged their faces into interest, the way people do when they expect entertainment to continue on cue. Monica's voice was steady as a winter beam. She said hello, and the hall seemed to lean toward a syllable. The goal she kept close was unchanged. Hold the center of herself, reveal only what served the truth, and do it without raising a hand. The museum glowed the way New York glows in late December, the garlands breathing pine and beeswax, the chandeliers scattering calm across the marble. Outside, Fifth Avenue wore a pale dusting. Inside, warmth rose from the crowd in waves. The night had offered its lesson in small humiliations. Now it would learn about a different kind of measure. Anthony, she said, and the name traveled like a bridge between two shores. His voice, crisp and even through the line, carried the cadence of a man who had been waiting for a signal. He reported the terms in careful words, as if he were placing panes of glass into a frame. The agreements were prepared, signatures queued, press language drafted for release. The number sat in the air without ornament. $2.5 billion, the kind of number that turns murmurs into attention and attention into silence. He asked gently whether she wished to confirm the announcement in the next hour. Monica looked at the dress that had been turned into a map, and then beyond it to the faces that had gathered to read it. She could feel the room cataloging her options, as if it were her business to keep its comfort intact. She did not rush. She did not make a show. She chose a sentence with the exactness of a key entering a lock. "Cancel everything," she said, and the words ran clear enough to find the ears that needed them. The hall inhaled and forgot to exhale. The quartet, unsure whether to continue, landed on a chord and held it half a breath too long. Margaret's smile tilted, uncertain for the first time, then stiffened into something that pretended it was meant to be this way. Ethan's hand still holding his phone drifted downward, as if it had suddenly become heavy. Charlotte's face brightened reflexively, rehearsed, to capitalize on any moment that threatened to belong to someone else. Then she realized the lens could not help her and lowered it. Richard, who had been scanning for trustees and cameras with the ease of a man used to curating his angles, turned toward the sound of a stake being pulled from the ground. Monica ended the call with a thank you that was neither theatrical nor small. She slid the phone into her clutch and reached for a card the color of calm steel. Its weight was slight, but the letters on it bore weight, each line etched rather than printed. She held it as if she were presenting a simple fact, which she was. She crossed the few steps of marble that separated her from the nearest cluster of listening faces and placed the card on the high table that had held her glass of water not long before. No flourish, no preamble. The chandelier light chased across the engraved words and came to rest. The title did not require explanation. It resisted the room's habit of asking for one. The name beneath was the name the room would remember. For a heartbeat, the museum existed in two times: the minute before everyone knew and the minute after. Then the divide closed with a hush that felt like the tide drawing back from a shore. The master of ceremonies found that his voice would not carry easily. A donor near the aisle sat back slowly as if the chair had grown a spine. The bartender glanced at the card and then at Monica with an expression that was not surprise so much as recognition, the way a person nods to a record finally put in order. A server rescued a stray shard the sweep had missed and, as she straightened, allowed herself a brief look that contained warmth without asking for anything in return. Monica did not raise her voice. She addressed the room the way one speaks to a gathering that understands plain truth. She said the partnership was no longer appropriate. She said commitments could be redirected, effective immediately, to purposes that honor the values that every plaque and every speech in that hall claimed to cherish. She spoke the name of a fund whose mission was clear: to widen doors that too often narrow around people who look like her and work as hard as she has. She did not list grievances. She did not itemize the insults the night had displayed. She kept the sentences broad enough to hold the facts and precise enough to admit no argument. Margaret found her voice first, thin at the edges. She aimed for indignation, but landed on a tremor she could not send smooth. "This is preposterous," she said, as if the word might glue the room back together. Richard lifted his chin. Searching for the note a patriarch is meant to strike when money threatens to change directions. "I am sure there is a misunderstanding," he began, and the sentence sounded borrowed. Charlotte tried laughter, then set it down midway. Ethan stepped forward a half step, and the instinct to film what he could not control faltered. For once, the glass rectangle in his hand did not know where it belonged. Monica's gaze moved from face to face in a calm arc, the way a lighthouse moves a beam across open water. Near the bronze wall, a museum staffer with a clipboard watched with wide, attentive eyes. The master of ceremonies attempted another friendly transition and failed. The quartet lowered their bows and waited. The room had become a study in stillness, the kind that follows a verdict. Without raising a hand, without lifting a finger, she had changed the temperature of the air. Anthony's voice returned through the line, muted now inside her clutch, confirming in a few quiet words that the cancellations had begun. The legal triggers did their work in offices far from the Gala, but the first ripple reached the hall almost at once. A trustee glanced at his phone and paled. Another checked the text and pretended to receive news about weather. The social current shifted so slightly that only those who have learned to read a tide could see it. Monica did not press the advantage. She did not need to. Truth, once spoken plainly, has its own momentum. She picked up the engraved card again and slipped it away with the care one gives a thing that carries more than ink. She thanked the server who had protected strangers' shoes from glass. She nodded to the bartender, and the bartender, relieved to be addressed as a person again, bowed his head in the smallest acknowledgement a crowded room can hold. A woman at a nearby table gray hair sat in the tidy waves of someone who remembers different winters folded her napkin slowly and placed it beside her plate. Her husband reached for her hand beneath the linen, and their fingers found each other as if they had practiced for such a moment. Margaret attempted a counter-narrative. "You cannot hijack an evening like this," she said. And there was a faint chorus of agreement from those who did not wish to confront how evenings like this are constructed in the first place. Monica turned toward her, not to argue, but to place a fact where it belonged. She said the evening belonged to the museum and to the city, to the people whose names were carved into the wall for their generosity, and to the people whose labor made the generosity visible. She said no one had hijacked anything. A transaction had been reconsidered in public because its terms had declared themselves in public. She did not let the sentence sharpen. She kept it level, the tone one uses when setting a table straight. Charlotte tried softness. "Surely," she said, making the word stretch, "you would not want a spilled drink to define a partnership." The line had the ring of a caption she would have liked to write. Monica let the silence after it do the work, and the silence did not favor Charlotte. "This is not about a glass," Monica said, and the room heard what she did not need to say next. This was about the hands that held it, and the eyes that watched it fall, and the habit of certain people to pretend the scene happens by accident when their foot has already nudged the edge of a shoe. Near the stage, the master of ceremonies made one last attempt to shepherd the evening back to the script. He thanked donors. He signaled for the next piece. The quartet obliged, but their bows made a sound like breath through teeth. A camera flashed from the media rail near the back cut across the room, and a reporter's pen began to move. The story would travel, of course it would, because rooms that practice exclusion in small, Pretty ways always think they can do it without witnesses. Tonight, witnesses had been invited, they had RSVP'd in numbers the host had not anticipated. The bartender, who had spent the night making other people's mixtures, poured a glass of water, added a slice of lemon with the care of a good habit, and set it where Monica could reach. No one moved to stop him. The staffer with the clipboard exhaled as if she had been holding her lungs for an hour. A server tucked her towel into her waistband and let the corners of her mouth rise the width of a heartbeat. None of these gestures erased what had been done. None of them were meant to. They were small acknowledgments that a compass had been taken from a pocket and turned until it pointed north. Richard stepped forward, as if physical proximity could stitch influence back into the air. "We can discuss this," he said. He heard the plea in his voice and tried to reshape it into command. "Tomorrow," he added, as if time were a thing he could still schedule for other people. Monica looked at him the way one looks at a man standing on a pier, watching the tide leave. "There is nothing to discuss," she said, and the kindness in her tone made the words stronger, not softer. "The decision is final." Phones resumed their quiet glowing. Somewhere beyond the walls, a car horn gave one curt note and went still. The museum breathed. The garlands kept their scent. A draft slipped under the door and lifted a corner of a program on a nearby table. As if to underline that winter waits, even when rooms pretend it does not, a small cluster of guests near the entrance turned and began to drift toward their coats, their movements lacking the choreography that had brought them in. The donors' names shone on, indifferent to the fuss. Monica tipped her chin a fraction and nodded once to the hall, a gesture that claimed responsibility for her words without asking for approval. She neither celebrated nor apologized. She stood, the map on her dress drying into a darker geography, the stain now simply part of the fabric and not a performance anyone could spin. In the hush that followed, the evening understood that it had been split. The hours before the sentence and the hours after. The before had felt rich and easy. The after would feel honest. Richard's hand trembled a little, the way hands tremble when habit meets reality. He gripped the stem of his glass too high, near the bowl, and the glass, delicate as an idea, betrayed him. It slipped, kissed the marble, and burst into sharp syllables that echoed under the vaults. Richard dropped his wine glass, and the shatter rang like a death knell for the Astorwell family. From the echo of shattered crystal, the room tried to recover its script, but the script no longer belonged to it. The master of ceremonies attempted to glide back to pleasantries, then let his hand fall when no one followed. Monica stood with the poise of a lighthouse after a storm, and from the side entrance a small team stepped in with the quiet certainty of people who carry authority in folders rather than on their sleeves. Laura Kim, precise and unhurried, introduced herself to the nearest museum coordinator and opened a leather portfolio whose contents had been drafted, reviewed, and set to move the moment a single sentence cleared the air. The callback to what had just happened, glass breaking like a bell hung over the hall. The foreshadow was plainer still. The bell was not for a toast. The purpose of this term was simple and complete. Monica meant to call what had been done by its name and to answer it with a system built for enforceable facts. Contracts amended, lines of credit revoked, filings lodged, notices served. She would not raise her voice or her hand. She would place paper where performance had been, and let paper do what paper can do when it is backed by intention and the law. The setting held steady around her, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in winter. Garlands breathing pine, brass railings catching chandelier light, a great hall thick with donors, perfume and the faint ire of melted snow. Outside, Fifth Avenue went on being Fifth Avenue. Inside, something old in the way this city arranges power tilted, and you could feel the tilt in your feet. The faces in play made a new kind of tableau. Monica remained at the center, composed, watchful, her clutch now only a clutch again. Laura Kim stood a pace to the side, a row of associates behind her like notes on a staff. Anthony Reed stayed on the line in case a signature or a signal needed his voice. Richard Astorwell had moved from performance to calculation and found the transition unsteady. Margaret perched on dignity, the way a person perches on a chair with a missing leg. Ethan orbited with a phone that had learned, all at once, the limits of its power. Charlotte saw a flattering angle and could not locate one. Around them, trustees, patrons, a city council aide, a curator who had never expected to witness a reckoning in the middle of a gala, and staff who knew the building better than anyone stood still enough to hear sentences land. Laura read the first notice in a voice meant for rooms that need clarity. Effective immediately, the equity commitment contemplated between Orion Global and the Astorwell entities was rescinded for cause. The cause did not need to be enumerated for the hall. The hall had enumerated it for itself. A quiet thrill of attention ran through the guests. A thrill that was not delight so much as recognition that they were present at one of those turns people mention years later and say, "I was there when." A trustee swallowed and checked a phone that buzzed with a message from a banker who rarely buzzed during parties. The quartet lowered their bows and let the silence be music for a while. Phones made a second sound in the room. Alerts multiplied like reflections in a mirrored hall. Hashtags budded, some clumsy, some sharp enough to cut. A reporter near the media rail lifted a camera and then lowered it, unwilling to break the way truth was speaking for itself. The bartender, relieved of the burden of choosing which eyes to obey, poured water, added lemon, and slid the glass toward the only person whose thirst mattered to him at that moment. A server had tucked her towel into her waistband and rested one hand at the small of her back, the way you do after you keep something from breaking for longer than anyone noticed. With the first notice delivered, Laura introduced the second, revocation of bridge financing lines that had kept several Astorwell projects in motion. The words were plain enough to understand even for those who did not live in that world. Money that flows like a river until a hand turns the wheel at the reservoir. A donor exhaled through his nose in that soft way men do when they realize their calendar tomorrow holds a meeting they had not planned to have. Another, a woman with winter white hair and the posture of a dancer, set down her glass and folded her hands, as if to bear witness properly requires hands to be still. Ethan tried for bravado, a green pitch to suggest none of it mattered. It did not convince his own mouth. Charlotte reached for tone and found none. Her phone, for once, had no caption ready. Margaret attempted to enlist the room. "Surely we are not going to permit a tantrum to derail civic generosity," she said, her voice wearing a steadiness she did not feel. The word tantrum sank like a stone in clear water. Monica turned slightly, not to debate, but to place the truth on the table where everyone could see it. Generosity without respect is a costume. The city deserves the real garment. The progression of the evening settled into its new logic. In the first movement, the papers laid out which properties would enter receivership when the bridge turned to sand. In the second, the council noted that the foundation sponsorships connected to the planned merger would be redirected to a fund with governance that matched its mission in deed rather than in inscription. In the third, notices of personnel changes at Astorwell managed ventures were served not with drama, but with the politeness that honest endings deserve. The museum's coordinator, a woman with a clipboard and a pulse that had finally slowed, made space for the transom of staff moving through with trays. The event itself had to continue, and it did, the way life does. The music resumed in careful measures. Servers returned to their orbit. People breathed, and then Monica spoke the line the hall would remember. She did not spit it or sharpen it. She let it arrive the way the tide arrives irresistibly. "You call me worthless," she said, and the pronoun felt less like a single person and more like a long accumulation of people. "Now you are zero." It wore no cruelty. It wore arithmetic. It wore the uncomplicated logic of a ledger that, once corrected, balances. The sentence reached the back wall, ricocheted softly, and slid under the cuffs of a dozen shirts, making the wrists inside them colder. It was the climax, because everything that had happened until now led here, and everything that would happen afterward would answer to it. The quartet found the downbeat of a piece by memory and began to play with a steadiness that helped the room hold still. Laura continued in her measured way. Filings transmitted to courts, notices dispatched to lenders, press language delivered to outlets with time-stamped embargoes. The dominoes had been set a long time. Tonight a finger tapped the first one, and the line ran. Around the edges of the hall, micro-stories unfolded. A young staffer from the family foundation stared at the floor, counting breaths and the number of months it might take to find work someplace less expensive. A museum guard adjusted his stance and remembered a cousin who had once told him that the city eventually shows you where it keeps its doors. Two trustees exchanged a look that meant, "We will speak in the morning," and also, "We will say as little as possible on record." A woman who had sounded pleased earlier when the room enforced a rule found herself less pleased now that a larger rule was being enforced and tried on silence for the first time all night. It would have been easy to conclude with a declaration and a walkout. Monica did not. She stayed long enough to honor the museum staff with direct thanks, a word, an eye contact, a nod that made their work visible. She thanked the bartender with the same calm she had used for the banking language and the line that had cut through vanity. She asked the coordinator whether any of this created undue pressure for the logistics crew. The coordinator shook her head and said with sincerity that the building could handle a change in weather. Anthony texted a final confirmation that the river had indeed turned. Laura closed her portfolio on the last sheaf of papers and slipped a pen into its loop with the small satisfaction of a task done precisely. Then the reactions came like weather breaking at once over a city. Charlotte's composure dissolved the way sugar dissolved in hot tea. Tears found her lashes and kept finding them. Margaret's voice climbed the scale and would not come back down, as if volume could build a bridge where trust had burned. Richard reached for an old tone and could not locate it. The sound that came out was a man speaking in the hallway where the lights had gone dark. Guests who had stayed to see which way the wind would blow reached for their coats with the guilty relief of people who like to be home when the news breaks. The museum, wise in the ways of crowds, widened the path to the cloakroom without anyone noticing it had done so. Charlotte burst into tears, Margaret screamed, but Monica signaled to the attorney to continue the legal procedures right there in the ballroom. The city held the memory of that winter night at the museum the way a bell holds the memory of its last note. From the moment the room split into a before and an after, the story moved outward through offices and sidewalks, through court calendars and bank ledgers, through kitchens where people told what they had heard, and trains where writers scrolled past the same headline repeated in different font. A season changed, then another, and in the long corridor of days, the Met evening stopped being gossip and became a mark on the calendar of how power behaves when it is asked to look in the mirror. The aim now was to close the account in a human register, to show what consequence looks like when the party ends, to name what endures and what must be rebuilt, to hold up the seam where a public humiliation was turned into a public correction. The museum's garlands had long since come down, and in their place the city wore the everyday decorations of working life. Street carts breathed onion and mustard into the cold. Coffee shops lifted their metal grates each morning as if revealing a stage. Sidewalk salt left pale signatures on boots and hems. On weekday dawns, the subway deepened its voice and said, "Good morning," the only way it knows how, with doors opening and closing, and the rattle that tells you the day is underway. On an ordinary morning in Brooklyn, Richard stood on a platform where breath showed in faint clouds and a long stripe of sky peeled itself over the buildings. He wore a jacket that had seen better winters and carried a ring of keys that clinked in a way he had never thought would belong to him. When the train arrived, he stepped in and found the pole near the door, making room with the old instinct of a man who still expects space to form around him and the new habit of a man who knows it will not. He studied the car the way he used to study a room full of donors. A young mother balanced a stroller and a tote bag. A nurse in scrubs skimmed a textbook in a language that did not advertise itself. Two teenagers traded headphones and opinion. No one looked twice at him. When he surfaced at the next station, he walked past a deli with a sign that promised hot bagels and free smiles, and then turned into the building whose boiler would be his responsibility when the temperature dropped below comfort. He signed for a delivery, learned the eccentricities of a log that stuck if a person turned it the wrong way, and answered the polite frustration of a tenant whose heat had clicked off in the night. "We will get it back," he said. And in those words, there was the awkward fit of someone who had practiced a different kind of promise for a long time. At lunch, he sat on a crate near the trash cans, ate a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and looked up at the slice of blue people call sky between the brick. He did not, for the length of a bite, think about marble floors or chandeliers. He thought about the hiss radiators make when they forgive you. Across the river in Manhattan, Margaret's day wore a similar newness, though she kept old habits close like gloves in the pocket. At a boutique where the sweaters were arranged by tone, she matched edges and smooth folds with a precision that would have made a head housekeeper proud. She greeted each customer with a smile pitched to seem personal, offered assistance, stepped back, then stepped forward at the right minute. When a woman asked whether the store had a size in the back, Margaret went to the stockroom and returned with careful speed, hoping the answer would be yes, pleased when it was, and learning the little thrill of a sale closed by competence instead of pedigree. At the register, she placed purchases into tissue with a care that made the paper sigh. She asked, with the scripted kindness of the job, whether the customer wanted a gift receipt. She thanked by name, the way the tag told her to, and meant it more than she expected. The first time someone recognized her from a society page, the recognition stayed behind the woman's eyes like a shadow that never reached the mouth. The woman paid, smiled, and left, carrying a bag that did not announce another person's history the way newsprint does. In the break room, Margaret sat with tea and a granola bar, and if her hands shook, she set the cup down and let them still before lifting it again. She was learning that a day can be navigated with skill even if it contains no applause. At a downtown bar illuminated by a neon sign that had been humming since before he was born, Ethan cleaned glasses with a towel that snagged on a chip only he felt. He learned the regulars' orders the way a good bartending school tells you to. A man in a navy suit with whiskey rye, a pair of construction workers who never wanted a slice of lime, a teacher who liked her beer poured slower than seemed reasonable. The first nights he strutted, trying to reverse the flow of attention, and gave himself away. Then he quieted. He learned to hear a joke without needing to top it. When someone slipped a folded bill into the tip jar with a nod, he found humility sitting next to the money and tried to keep both. Sometimes, late in the evening, a group in cocktail clothes would drift in after a gallery opening, and he would feel the old music tug at his feet. He had practiced the gait of that life so long that his body remembered it like a hymn learned in childhood. He kept his head down and made it proper Manhattan. He asked whether they preferred a cherry or a twist and did not reach for a phone. He could not find a caption for this part of life, and it was good that he could not. Charlotte rose before dawn, tied her apron, and learned the rhythm of a chain cafe, where the line folds around the room and the orders arrive in a language of shorthand and gratitude. She wrote names on cups, delivered them with a smile that, on some mornings, climbed the ladder of sincerity, and on other mornings, stood politely on the lower rungs. She learned that when a customer says they need it extra hot, they are telling you about more than temperature. She learned the soft science of remembering a regular's pastry and having it ready before they asked. The way a person can make another person feel seen with a single gesture. Once a man in a coat that had attended more than one gala stepped up and asked for a double espresso and a small kindness, though he did not use those words. Charlotte slid the cup across the counter and watched the absence of recognition move over his face like shade over water. It was not a relief and not an insult. It was a kind of erasure she had not known to expect. Later that week, a woman in a winter hat came in with a child who protested the day. Charlotte made a foam heart on the cocoa for the child and watched the protest shrink by half. Walking home after her shift, she passed the museum and did not look up. In a hall on the west side, where the ceiling had heard speeches and songs and the scrape of chairs between both, Monica stood before a set of microphones that did not need to shout. The banners behind her named a fund whose mission had been spelled in plain words: to provide capital, mentoring, and a path to contracts for small businesses, led by people who had learned to expect great scrutiny at doors that opened easily for others. The room smelled of coffee and hope. On the front row sat a baker who had turned her grandmother's recipe into a storefront and wanted to add a second oven. A coder who had been freelancing from a borrowed desk. A carpenter who had a crew of 3 and a backlog of work if only the financing would settle. Reporters kept their questions folded for now and let the ceremony do its work. Monica spoke about accountability without bitterness and about opportunity without sentimentality. She did not say the museum's name. She said that a city tells the truth about itself by the doors it maintains, and the doors it insists are locked. She said that no banner is worth the fabric if it does not match what happens under it. She said that money is not magic, but it is a tool, and that the right tools placed in the right hands can change the way a neighborhood looks at its morning. Her voice carried in the way a certain kind of voice does when it has learned to accept the weight of what it carries without strain. She invited a baker to say a few words. The baker explained how a loan with terms that did not punish her would mean hiring 2 additional workers and moving deliveries from late night to early morning when the bread would be still warm when they met the door. A young developer spoke of a community center app that would make services visible to people who did not have a habit of asking for them. A carpenter described the way a contract changes a man's appetite. When you know you can pay people fairly, you taste your dinner differently. The applause was not loud, but it was right. The city's reporters took down sentences, and some had the look of people who had covered too many stories that ended with a ribbon and then unraveled. They wanted to believe this one would hold. The fund's governance sat on a slide that bore few names and clear rules. There will be oversight. There will be reports. There will be lines no one could cross without a public record. The boring parts of integrity were in place, and Monica was content to let the boring parts do the glamorous work. No photograph could tie these days neatly to the gala in winter, but the thread was exactly the right length. A holiday season had come and gone. The lights across the avenues had been packed into boxes and stored above closets. On a weekday afternoon, a woman with gray hair placed a hand on the arm of her husband as they walked past a newspaper stand and said, "Do you remember?" He did. He remembered the red on the white, and the way a sentence had traveled across a hall and into a year. They bought a paper and took it to the diner where the waitress kept the coffee pot ready for them because they tipped without show and asked after her mother as if she mattered, which she did. The sharp image this chapter carried the one the mind would choose to keep when the others faded unfolded in a coffin on an ordinary corner. Charlotte, hair pulled back, hands steady, called out the name written on the cup. A man in the coat stepped forward, said thank you without looking up, and left change in the jar. He did not recognize a barista. He did not need to. The coffee was correct, the lid tight, the day already moving. Charlotte wiped the counter in a clean arc, looked toward the door where the bell made its old-fashioned note, and took the next order. You could call it justice, but the word might be too neat. It was, at least, a consequence that fit the facts. On a different evening, the West Side Hall filled again, this time for a formal announcement of the fund's first awards. The stage held a modest arrangement of winter flowers. The light warmed the faces of the people toward whom the city had not always warmed. Monica stepped into that light and spoke the words that had been asked of her, and then spoke the words she had not been asked for, but that the moment required. Respect costs nothing. The lack of it can cost you everything. She let the sentence sit where everyone could see it, the way you lay a tool on the bench so anyone can pick it up. Reporters had their story. People in chairs had their names called, and when they stood to receive a folder, they stood like people who had waited a long time, not for charity, but for fair terms. At the back of the room, a security guard who had worked the night at the museum watched with careful attention, as if memorizing a better procedure. A city council member stopped rehearsing his next run for higher office and applauded like a person who understood the meaning of the evening. A server moved down the aisle with bottles of water and did not have to check any eyes before she set them on the tables. Winter has softened to late winter, which is really only early spring trying to happen under coats. Outside, the curb glittered in patches where the last snow had surrendered to sun and then hardened again. A driver idled by the hydrant and read a paperback without apology. In a window, a violinist tuned for a recital that would begin when the hall emptied and the families arrived with hair smooth and shoes shined. The city went on, keeping its many lives in parallel, as it always does, failures and repairs, pettiness and grace, all running side by side like tracks that meet only in maps. When the evening reached its end, Monica stepped to the edge of the stage and looked out at the people whose names had been placed into a different ledger. A baker lifted her hand in thanks. A developer rolled the program and tucked it behind his ear with a grin that belonged to school days. A carpenter put his palm to his chest for the length of a bead and then dropped it, embarrassed by his own feeling. If she had wanted to, Monica could have said that the fund would wipe out every unfairness. She did not. She said only that tomorrow she and the city would get to work. It was the kind of promise a person can keep. In the end, the museum night was still in the story, not as a wound that would not close, but as a seam that had been stitched in a straighter line. The people who had laughed learned the flavor of quiet. The people who had watched without acting learned the weight of that choice and made different ones in smaller rooms where there were fewer witnesses. The people who had helped even a little discovered that help multiplies the way a good recipe does when shared. The city did not become pure. It became, for a while, clearer. Monica left the stage to applause, stepped into the New York winter night. Snow fell again, but this time she stood in the light. The city remembered that winter evening not for its glitter, but for the moment a quiet voice turned spectacle into accountability, and the bruising humiliation became a hinge toward better work. Lives did not end. They changed direction. A family learned ordinary days. A fund opened practical doors. And the room that once applauded itself learned to listen. The lessons simple and demanding. Dignity is owed, not earned. Power without respect unravels, while love in action, steady loans, fair chances, honest thanksments, what pride breaks, and less contrition begin as small repairs. In any neighborhood, when bias tries to lock a door, neighbors who refuse to look away can turn the key together, and the house becomes a home again. Take a quiet minute to notice the lamps of unadvertised kindness around you, and if this story warms something long chilled, consider passing that warmth along like a porch light left on through the night. It does not boast, but it shows the way home.